There's a bell tower in the north of Italy that rises out of a frozen lake. In winter, when the lake freezes solid, visitors walk across the ice to touch the stone. There is no village around it. There has not been a village around it since the summer of 1950. The village was called Curon. It's out in the Vinchgau Valley in German-speaking South Tyrol. 163 buildings, parish church built in the 14th century, about 150 families. The dam was finished in July of 1950. The Italian state had taken over the region 30 years earlier. After the First World War, the South Tyrolean families who lived there spoke German. They were paid a few hundred lire per house. The engineers decided the buildings could not be left to stand under the water. Floating debris would damage the dam. Between late 1949 and the spring of 1950, all 163 buildings of ground were dynamited. The bell tower was not dynamited. It had been classified as a protected monument under earlier Austrian law. The Italian engineers respected the listing. They demolished the nave of the church around it and left the tower standing. On July 18th of that year, 1 week before the demolition was completed, the bells were removed, and the lake closed over what was left. The tower has stood in the water for 76 years. It is not the only tower of its kind. 3,000 kilometers east of Curon, on the upper Volga River, another tower still stands above the water. It belongs to a town called Kalyazin. Kalyazin sits on the upper Volga, 3 hours by car north of Moscow. It dates to the 12th century. Its St. Nicholas Monastery was founded in 1434, 500 years later. The monastery had a bell tower 74.5 meters tall. The tower was built in the 1800s, 5 stories of pale brick, a copper-clad dome at the top. In 1939, the Soviet state began filling the Ugalich Reservoir. Kalyazin's lower streets were below the new water line. The monastery was below the new water line. The cathedral was below the new water line. The engineers cleared the site. The monastery was dynamited. The cathedral was demolished. The lower town was bulldozed. The bell tower was not officially. The dam administration said it was too expensive to demolish. Unofficially, the local historians say that someone in the administration insisted on leaving it. They never said who or why. The water rose around it. By 1940, it stood alone in the middle of a 4,000 square kilometer reservoir, with no cathedral around it, no monastery around it, no town around it. It is still there. Tourists take small boats out to the base of it. In summer, in winter, the lake freezes and people walk across the ice to Chadrick. The bells are gone, the interior is empty. The masonry is cracking in places where the freeze-thaw has gone on for 9 decades. Restoration work began in 1927. It has been intermittent. The official position of the Russian Orthodox Church is that the tower remains consecrated. And there is a story that on calm summer evenings, residents of nearby villages can still hear the old bells of the monastery rising from under the water. There are no bells in the tower. Whatever they hear, they do not hear it from them. 2 towers, 2 countries, 10 years apart, neither dynamited, neither rebuilt. Each one is what was left when someone decided that the village around it would go under. Move west again, 2,000 kilometers to the foothills of the Spanish Pyrenees. There's a province they called Huesca. In Huesca, there's a town called Mediano. Well, there was Mediano sat in the valley of the river. St. Gad had a Romanesque church called Santa Maria, built in the 12th century. A bell tower of pale stone, 16 meters high. About 120 families, olive trees on the slopes above. A bridge over the river, a school. In 1969, the Spanish state finished a dam 30 kilometers downstream. The reservoir was filled in a single year. The village was not given time to be moved. Most of the residents had already left. A few stayed in their houses until the day the water reached the doors. They were moved to a hillside above the new shoreline. They watched the church go under from a footpath that is still there. The Romanesque church was not dynamited. The tower stands above the waterline now. When the reservoir is at full capacity, sometimes it stands a meter above the surface. In dry years, more comes back. In the summer of 2017, the reservoir dropped to 27% of capacity. The walls of Mediano came back. The street grid was visible from the air. The footpath down from the relocated village reconnected to the old square in the bottom of the valley. Some of the original residents were still alive. They walked down to the church. The interior of the church had been emptied in 1969. The altar had been removed and reinstalled in the new church up the hill. The pews were gone, the plaster on the walls had dissolved. What remained was the floor. The floor was paved with stones engraved, with the names of the families who had been buried in the church between the 12th century and the 18th. Their descendants had not been moved with them. They had not been exhumed. When the water comes back, the floor of the church is under it again. The names go down with it. The same is true on the other side of the country, 500 kilometers east of Mediano. In Catalonia, there's another village called Sant Romà de Sau. It was settled in the 11th century. Its parish church was built in Lombard Romanesque style, with a square bell tower of pale stone 23 meters tall. About 60 families lived there. A road wound down to it from the surrounding hills. In 1962, the Spanish state filled a reservoir called the Planta de Sau, Sant Romà de Sau, and under in stages across the same year. The villagers were given 6 months. Most were paid less than 5,000 pesetas per house, a few months of an agricultural worker's wages. Some emigrated to Barcelona, some went to France. The bell tower of the Romanesque church was left standing. The local priest had argued for it. He had argued that the tower should not be torn down because the village had stood around it for 800 years and nothing of the village would survive if the tower did not. He was right. 60 years later, the tower is still there most of the year. Half of it is underwater. The water line cuts across the second story. In drought years, the rest of it comes back. In 1990, the reservoir fell to 15% of capacity. The streets of Sant Romà de Sau were walkable for the first time in 28 years. It happened again in 27, again in 2022, again in 2023. But each time the descendants of the displaced come back. Some bring chairs and sit what used to be the square. Some put candles in the empty windows, and Some lower a single floating votive lamp into the slow, shallow water near the church door. The tower has been classified as Spanish National Heritage since 1993. There's a small museum in the relocated village above the waterline that holds photographs and household objects donated by the families who left. The most visited object in the museum is a small wooden cross that came from the schoolhouse. It was taken out the morning the water arrived. 2 towers above 2 reservoirs in 2 regions of Spain, both Romanesque, both kept standing, both visited every summer by the people whose grandparents walked down the same road as children. The towers were not the reason the villages survived in memory. The towers were what survived, because the villages had stood around them long enough to make them mean something. 800 kilometers west of Sant Romà de Sau, across the Spanish border into Portugal, there is another reservoir. It is small, 2 square kilometers. It sits inside the Penedjerays National Park, near the border with Spanish Galicia. It covers a village that had stood there since the 1st century after Christ. The village was called Vilarinho da Furna, and it was settled by Romans on a road called the Via Nova. The road connected Bracara Augusta, modern Braga, to Asturca Augusta in northern Spain. Roman milestones are still visible in the area today. Vilarinho da Furna stood by the road for 1900 years. About 300 people lived in it, 57 households. They were shepherds, millers, weavers, farmers of rye and chestnut. They governed themselves with a system that had no equivalent anywhere else in Portugal. It was called comunitarismo, community government. Every head of household had a vote on the village council. The council met every Thursday. The bell of the chapel was rung 3 times before each meeting. First 3 strokes, then 10 minutes, then 3 more strokes, then 10 minutes, then a single stroke to begin. If a man broke the rules of the council, he could be declared not a vizinho, not a neighbor. The community was forbidden to help him. If his hay cart overturned, no one could help him right it. If a person died in his house, no one could fetch a coffin or call the priest. He could buy his way back in, eventually. After paying a fine of 20 escudos to each villager who had been forced to pass him by. In 1969, a Portuguese filmmaker named Antonio Campos arrived in Vilarinho with a 16mm camera. He'd been sent by the Portuguese state not to record the village's history, to record what the village did every day in the last months before the dam was finished. Campos lived in the village for almost a year. He filmed the harvest, he filmed the bell ringing, he filmed the council meetings, he filmed the threshing of the rye and the milling of the chestnut. He filmed the children walking to the school. He filmed an interview with an elder of the council called Senhor Aníbal Gonçalves Pereira. Senhor Aníbal had been declared not a vizinho once. Decades earlier, he had been outside the community for 3 years. He had bought his way back, and eventually, by blocking the path with his goats one afternoon so that no other neighbor could pass, the other villagers had been so angry they voted him back in just to make the goats move. Senhor Aníbal told Campos this story on camera. He laughed when he told it. Campos asked him whether he resented being thrown out. He said no. He said the rules were the rules and the village had survived because the rules were the rules. Campos asked him what he thought of the dam. He said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, the rules will go with the village. There are no rules outside the village. There has not been a village like this anywhere else for a very long time. The dam was finished in 1972. The last residents left in 1971. Senhor Aníbal was among them. He was 81 years old. The bell of the chapel was taken down the week before the water arrived. The community paid for it to be carried to a small museum that would not exist for another 14 years. Buildings were not dynamited. They had been built of granite blocks fitted without mortar for 15 centuries. They were left to the water. The water rose over them in a single month. Campos's film was edited and shown in Lisbon in 1971. The Portuguese state did not promote it. The political situation was complicated. Marcelo Caetano's Estado Novo was 3 years from collapse, and the documentary form was not where the government wanted attention. The film survived because the Lisbon Film Archive kept a copy. It has been re-released several times since. It is the only moving record of how the village actually worked. In 1985, the surviving displaced residents formed an association of the former inhabitants of Vilarinho da Furna. They bought a small disused schoolhouse in a relocated village above the waterline. They put the bell of Vilarinho da Furna inside it. They put the wooden door from the council hall inside. They put a copy of Senhor Aníbal's interview inside it, on a loop in the corner, with a small bench in front of it for the descendants to sit on. In dry years, the village comes back. In 1989, the reservoir dropped far enough that the threshing circle in the center of the village was walkable for 2 weeks. It happened again in 1992, again in 2005, again in 27, again in 2017, again in 2021. Each time, members of a Furna come down to the dry valley floor. Some of them are old enough to remember walking the same path as children. They walk down to the threshing circle. They walk down to the doorway of the chapel. They walk down to the place where the council hall used to stand. Some of them leave a small object on the ground where their grandfather had once kept his door key. Most of the visitors leave before the water comes back and stay until the very last day. They watch the level rise from a hillside above. Senhor Aníbal died in 1979. He never lived to see the village come back. The granite walls have not moved. The rye that used to grow in the threshing circle is gone. The chestnut trees on the slopes were drowned with the village. The stone is still there. And the rules went with the village. 3 towers above 3 reservoirs in 3 countries, a community government that survived 2 empires and 17 centuries did not. There is one more tower worth seeing. It is not above water. It's above acid. In 1977, the Romanian government under Niculescu chose a valley in the Western Carpathians as the destination for waste from the largest copper mine in the country. The mine was called Roia Poieni. The destination for the waste was a small mountain village called Geamana. Geamana had about 1,000 residents, 400 houses, an Orthodox church built in the middle of the 19th century, a cemetery, a school. A Geamana river ran through the center. The state offered each family roughly 20,000 lei to leave, about $2,000 at the time, less than the value of a single house, even in Romania in 1977. Most of them took the money and left. A few refused. The flooding began in 1978. It was not flooding with water, and it was flooding with tailings. tailings are what is left of crushed ore after the metal has been removed. For copper, the process is called froth flotation. Ore is crushed, mixed with water and sulfuric acid, treated with cyanide to separate the copper sulfides. What remains is a slurry of silica, pyrite, heavy metal residues, and the chemical agents themselves. It is the color of poison. Where the iron in the ore oxidized, the slurry is red. Where the copper sulfate concentrated, the slurry is turquoise. Where the pyrite is exposed, it is bright yellow. The whole valley is a color map of what was poured into it. Geamana's parish church did not go under in a single year. The slurry rose at about 1 meter per year. The lower walls of the church went first, the pews went next. The altar went next. The roof was the bell tower went last, or rather, it has been going last, it is still going. In 2017, a New Zealand photographer named Amos Chappell visited the valley. He produced the photographs that made the place internationally known. The color palette was the point. A village church inside a chemical sea. He also spoke to the residents who had not left. There were fewer than 20 of them in the mid-2010s. They live on the hillsides above the slurry line. They're elderly. They subsist on small kitchen gardens, on pensions, and on rainwater. The well water near the village is contaminated. One of them is named Cornel Holoria. He gave several interviews. He said the air smells of sulfur. He said the slurry rises every year. He said he would not leave because his parents are buried in the cemetery, and the cemetery is now under the pond. In 2017, the mining company submitted a plan to demolish the remaining bell tower. They said it a safety hazard. They said the structure could collapse. The former residents organized through Chappell's reporting and through Romanian press. They argued that the demolition would erase the last visible trace of the village. They argued that without the tower, the place would simply become a tailings pond. Not a place that used to be a village. The mining company withdrew the proposal. The tower is still standing. The slurry is still rising at 1 meter per year. The Roya Poieni mine is still operating. Of all the towers in this episode, Geamana's is the only one whose disappearance is being scheduled by the calendar. 12,000 kilometers west of Geamana, on the eastern slope of the Andes, there is a Venezuelan state called Táchira. Táchira is high, cold mornings, warm afternoons, narrow valleys, towns built along the rivers that drain east toward the Orinoco. And one of those towns was called Potosí. Potosí had a parish church 25 meters tall, about 200 houses, about 1,000 to 100 residents, coffee farms on the slopes above, a small school, a cemetery on the western edge of the town. In 1985, the Venezuelan state finished the Urabanticaparo hydroelectric dam complex. Potosí was below the new water line. The residents were paid. Most relocated to nearby Andean towns. Some went to Caracas. The state did not dynamite the church. It was a matter of cost. There was no Italian protected monument listing here. There was no Russian Orthodox restoration agenda. The dam administration simply did not think it was worth the contract to demolish. And the water rose around it by 1986. Only the upper third of the church was above the surface. By 1990, only the cross at the top of the spire poked above the water. Boaters who crossed the reservoir called it a sentinel. Stood like that for 23 years. In 28, the rain stopped. An El Nino weather cycle stalled across the Pacific. Venezuela's reservoir levels dropped further than anyone had measured. Through 29 and into 2010, the Urabante reservoir fell roughly 30 meters below its full operating level. By the spring of 2010, for the first time in 23 years, the whole of Potosi was above water. Not the village it had been. The walls of the church behind the facade had collapsed. The houses were rubble. The cemetery markers were stone fragments scattered on dried mud. The streets were outlines, but it was Potosí. The international press arrived within weeks. National Geographic published before and after sequences. Reuters distributed photographs worldwide. Catholic and evangelical media used the image of the standing facade as a parable. Former residents came back from Caracas, from Mérida, from Maracaibo. Some had not been in the valley in 25 years. They walked across the dry mud of what had been the town square, and some of them brought relatives who had been born in Caracas, children, grandchildren, standing on streets they had only heard about. Some of them stopped at the cemetery edge. Some of them stood inside the empty facade of the church and looked up at where the roof had been. By the end of the year, the rains had returned. The reservoir began to fill again. By 2011, only the upper third of the church was visible. By 2012, only the cross. In 2015, the El Nino returned. Potosi came back briefly. In 2023, another drought. And the residents who can still travel will come back the next time it happens. 5 villages, 5 towers, 5 reservoirs in 5 countries on 3 continents. Each one was built over the same kind of place. A small village, a few hundred people, a church or a chapel that had been there longer than anyone in the village had been alive. Each one was offered the same trade: move out, take the compensation, the water is coming. And each one ended the same way. The village went under, the tower did not. Why did the tower not? In Curon, it was a protected monument listing under earlier Austrian law. In Kalyazin, it was a quiet decision somewhere in the dam administration. In Mediano and San Roma de Sau, it was a parish priest who argued that the village would not survive in memory if the tower did not. In Vilarinho, it was the granite, 15 centuries of dry stone construction by people who knew the rules of how to build a wall that would not fall. In Geamana, it was a former resident who refused to let the last visible trace of the village be scheduled for removal. In Potosí, it was a cost calculation by a Venezuelan engineer who saw no reason to spend money demolishing what the water would take. 5 reasons, 5 villages, one outcome. The places we look at on calendars and postcards: Curon, Kalyazin, San Roma de Sau. The places photographers go. 5 families of villages, 5 communities of descendants who still gather once a year or once a decade on the shoreline of the lake that took the place they came from. There are others. There are reservoirs where nothing was left. Reservoirs that took 4 entire towns and left only a town common walkable in dry years. Reservoirs where the village spoke a language the country was trying to bury along with it. Reservoirs where the people lost their homes, did not get the chance to come back even once. Reservoirs where a woman climbed into a small plane to fly to the capital to protest the flooding, and the plane never came down. Those are the next chapter. We will keep coming back to the lakes. This channel is called the Quiet Hill, and the next one will find you